In the quiet, shadowed corners of grand palaces, where the echo of noble footsteps barely reached, the true architects of future kings and queens went about their work unnoticed. These women, whose names history often forgot, were entrusted with the most precious charge of all, the lives of royal children. From the moment a newborn cried for the first time, a network of caretakers, wet nurses, governesses, and nannies enveloped the infant, creating a cocoon of warmth, education, and discipline that would define their every step in life. In the gilded nurseries, with sunlight spilling softly through tall, arched windows, the wet nurse's gentle hands guided tiny limbs, while the rhythmic lull of her voice became the child's first memory of comfort. Each nurse was chosen not only for her health and character but often for her wisdom, her resilience, and sometimes for reasons whispered behind the heavy velvet curtains of court, astrology, lineage, and the subtle influences of family alliances. These women, far from the public eye, wielded immense emotional power, for it was in their arms that future rulers first learned the nuances of care, trust, and affection. Mothers, often bound by duty to court or political intrigues, rarely spent long hours with their own children. Instead, they entrusted their offspring to these devoted figures who fed, soothed, and watched over them with unwavering vigilance. As the weeks turned to months and months into years, the children absorbed more than just nourishment. They absorbed manners, morality, and the whispered stories of the women who nurtured them. Governesses arrived next, their presence quieter but equally commanding. With the careful precision of a scholar and the gentle patience of a mentor, they introduced the young royals to the world of letters, numbers, and etiquette. The children learned the alphabet not merely to read words but to absorb the weight of knowledge, the subtleties of history, and the art of discerning the human heart. They learned to bow, to speak, to smile in ways that pleased not only their parents but the rigid expectations of a court that judged every gesture. These early lessons, seemingly small, would ripple through their lives, shaping rulers who might one day command armies, negotiate alliances, and navigate the treacherous waters of power. Beyond instruction, nannies maintained the rhythm of daily life, orchestrating baths, meals, walks in the palace gardens, and the occasional play that sparked imagination. They were guardians of safety, ensuring that no harm from illness or accident could touch the young princes and princesses. Every lullaby, every whispered story at twilight, every gentle rebuke for mischief became part of the child's internal map of the world, guiding behavior and forging bonds that neither crown nor title could replace. In these quiet hours, the hidden lives of these women intertwined with the lives of future monarchs, creating a delicate balance between duty, love, and influence. Though they remained unnamed in official records, their fingerprints rested upon the moral, emotional, and intellectual development of the rulers who would one day command armies and empires. Their stories, often told in letters, diaries, and fleeting anecdotes, reveal courage, intelligence, and devotion that surpass the boundaries of wealth, status, or recognition. And as the sun dipped behind the palace walls, casting long shadows over the nursery, one could almost hear the echo of lullabies and whispered guidance that would resonate through generations, shaping history in ways that no chronicler could ever fully capture. As the royal children grew, the role of the governess became increasingly vital. Each day in the palaces began with soft light spilling across polished floors, where the echoes of hurried servants barely touched the quiet determination of the women who oversaw the children's education. Governesses were often scholars in their own right, selected not only for intelligence but for patience, moral integrity, and an ability to anticipate the needs of their wards before even the child could articulate them. They guided hands over parchment, teaching letters and numbers, and introduced stories from history and mythology, carefully chosen to instill lessons of virtue, courage, and wisdom. In these lessons, the children learned more than mere words. They absorbed the weight of responsibility, the art of decision-making, and the importance of observation. Discipline was gentle yet firm. Missteps were met with quiet correction, and successes were celebrated with soft praise. reinforcing both confidence and obedience. Beyond academics, governesses became interpreters of courtly life, translating the rigid expectations of aristocracy into understandable actions and choices for young minds. They taught children to navigate complex social rituals, to bow or curtsy with grace, to speak with clarity and respect, and to watch carefully for the unspoken language of their elders. While the royal parents often remained distant, absorbed in politics, diplomacy, or ceremonial duties, these women provided continuity, stability, and a sense of security. Nannies and caregivers worked alongside them, ensuring meals were served on time, that beds were neatly prepared, and that play was balanced with lessons in decorum and self-control. These early routines, repeated day after day, became the invisible threads that wove the children's character and worldview. In the quiet corners of the nursery and the sunlit hallways of palaces, wet nurses hummed lullabies, governesses instructed in whispered tones, and nannies guided every step with a steady hand. Their lives were structured around the children's needs, yet their influence extended far beyond simple caretaking. They were the keepers of confidence, the listeners of secrets, and at times the silent counselors of future monarchs. Letters and memoirs, rarely intended for public eyes, hint at the depth of attachment between these women and the young royals. A child might write long after adulthood, recalling the soothing voice of a nurse at night, the patient guidance of a governess correcting a difficult lesson, or the playful encouragement of a nanny in the garden. These recollections reveal not only emotional bonds but also the subtle shaping of intelligence, temperament, and morality that would later influence decisions with political and historical significance. Even within the strict hierarchies of court life, these women carved out spaces of compassion, learning, and protection. They understood the delicate balance of authority and nurture, knowing when to correct and when to console, when to guide quietly, and when to let the child explore independently. In doing so, they forged a hidden world within the palace walls, one in which the future of kingdoms rested not only on royal blood but on the quiet, patient, and unrecorded labor of women devoted entirely to the upbringing of heirs. And as the day faded into evening, and the palace lights glimmered softly across the corridors, the children would drift to sleep not under the watchful eyes of kings and queens, but in the gentle presence of those who had loved, educated, and protected them from the very beginning. The corridors of palaces stretched endlessly, their marbled floors gleaming under the muted morning light that filtered through high-arched windows, and yet within this grandeur, the most significant life lessons occurred in spaces often overlooked by history. The nursery's quiet chambers lined with soft rugs and delicate tapestries held the daily dramas, triumphs, and small heartbreaks of the royal children, each one guided by the unseen hands of women whose influence would ripple through time. Wet nurses, chosen meticulously for their strength, patience, and character, offered the first experience of comfort and human connection, their arms a sanctuary from the weight of expectation that loomed over every infant born into privilege. These nurses hummed ancient lullabies, their songs carrying fragments of stories from distant villages or whispered tales from their own childhoods, weaving cultural memory into the lives of future monarchs who might never otherwise hear such voices. The gentle rocking, the warmth of skin against skin, the measured rhythm of a heartbeat, all of these combined to form the first impressions of the world for the young royals, shaping trust, security, and emotional resilience long before lessons in history or etiquette began. Governesses, appearing later in the daily schedule, brought the structured order of education, but education under their guidance was never mere rote memorization. Each lesson was layered with nuance, emphasizing not only knowledge but the ability to think critically, to discern motives, and to approach every interaction with caution and thoughtfulness. The alphabet became a gateway not only to literacy but to comprehension of human behavior, as letters turned into stories, and stories became mirrors of societal expectations, virtues, and the consequences of misjudgment. Numbers, carefully introduced in daily exercises, were never abstract. They were tied to management of household resources, understanding of commerce, and early lessons in governance that would later prove indispensable in ruling a kingdom. Meanwhile, manners and etiquette, taught through subtle demonstration rather than harsh reprimand, instilled a sense of poise and self-awareness. Each curtsy, each bow, each carefully modulated word carried with it the weight of history, the traditions of generations, and the careful calibration of behavior that could one day avert disaster or inspire loyalty. Nannies, too, played an irreplaceable role, overseeing meals, hygiene, and health, but also mediating the delicate dance between play and discipline. They transformed mundane routines into lessons in patience, fairness, and emotional intelligence, all while maintaining the careful boundaries dictated by court hierarchy. The children, growing under this invisible web of guidance, began to recognize the voices of these women as anchors in a world that was otherwise governed by unpredictability, politics, and ceremonial obligations. These caregivers were the first to understand the quirks, fears, and talents of each child, and their observations often shaped decisions far beyond the nursery walls. Letters from former pupils, preserved in private collections or occasionally referenced by historians, reveal the depth of these connections. A prince might recall the soft admonishment of a governess correcting a hesitant hand in ink, or the warmth of a nurse who stayed awake through cold nights to soothe a feverish brow. Such recollections, though intimate and often buried, highlight the profound influence these women wielded over character formation, decision-making, and even the moral compass of future leaders. In addition to emotional and intellectual guidance, these women subtly introduced children to the complexities of human relationships and the subtleties of trust and power. Through stories, gentle warnings, and observation, children learn to navigate friendships, rivalries, and alliances even before stepping into the broader world of politics. A seemingly innocent lesson in sharing toys or negotiating for privileges in the nursery often mirrored, on a microcosmic level, the diplomacy and negotiation that would later define a king or queen's reign. Seasonal routines further reinforced these lessons. Spring walks in the gardens became exercises in observation, patience, and appreciation for beauty. Autumn lessons indoors focused on literacy and numeracy. Winters provided intimate hours of storytelling by the fire, where history, mythology, and moral tales were woven into narratives that encouraged reflection, critical thinking, and imagination. Each day, structured yet flexible, emphasized the integration of knowledge, behavior, and emotion, ensuring that children were not only educated but cultivated to understand themselves, others, and the weight of responsibility they would one day carry. Beyond the formal and informal lessons, these women preserved the children's emotional stability. In a court where parental attention was scarce due to political obligations or ceremonial duties, the caregiver's presence provided continuity and security. Their constancy became a foundation upon which confidence, curiosity, and resilience were built. It was within these quiet, carefully orchestrated routines that children first learned to reconcile the privileges of birth with the discipline of duty. Their successes, praised softly, reinforced the importance of achievement without arrogance. Their failures, corrected with patience, taught perseverance and humility. Even games and play, often seen as trivial, were imbued with lessons in strategy, cooperation, and foresight, all vital for the minds of those destined to rule. Throughout these years, the subtle daily influence of these women extended far beyond what any history book could record. They were confidants, educators, emotional anchors, and at times, protectors from the political machinations that inevitably surrounded royal households. Their work required a blend of compassion, intelligence, and discretion, for the slightest misstep could have consequences not only for themselves but for the children in their care. The resilience, patience, and foresight demanded of them were immense, yet often overlooked in favor of celebrating the visible achievements of the royals they nurtured. Some of these women left written records of their lives, while others' legacies exist only in the behaviors, decisions, and moral codes of the rulers they helped shape. Their presence was a constant yet silent one, a guiding hand in moments of uncertainty, a soothing voice in times of fear, and a source of unwavering encouragement in the face of challenges. As children matured into adolescence, the complexity of education increased, encompassing diplomacy, multiple languages, etiquette for interacting with foreign dignitaries, and understanding the responsibilities of leadership. Governesses and tutors carefully balanced the imparting of knowledge with the cultivation of character, preparing the young royals for the intricate dance of court life. The emotional foundation laid by nannies and wet nurses ensured that, despite the pressures of aristocratic life, the children retained a sense of empathy, patience, and moral integrity. Indeed, these unseen women were architects of future leaders, shaping not just intellect but heart, temperament, and the capacity to inspire loyalty and respect. In reflecting upon these hidden lives, it becomes evident that the grandeur of palaces, the glittering ceremonies, and the power wielded by kings and queens were built upon the quiet labor of women who were rarely named, rarely celebrated, yet whose influence persisted across generations. Through lullabies, lessons, and gentle guidance, they imprinted values, knowledge, and emotional resilience that would ripple outward to affect the destinies of nations. And so, as evening descended upon the palace halls, the young royals rested not only in beds of silk and velvet but in the care, wisdom, and love of women who devoted their lives to nurturing the future of history, their quiet legacies carried forward in every decision, every triumph, and every act of governance performed by those they raised. As the royal children grew older, the quiet corridors of palaces echoed with more than the soft footsteps of wet nurses and the gentle hum of lullabies. The mornings brought structured routines that blended education, discipline, and exploration, while the afternoons became laboratories of social learning, where the governesses orchestrated lessons in diplomacy, etiquette, and the delicate art of perception. Adolescence introduced new challenges, the testing of boundaries, the stirrings of curiosity, and the subtle temptations of rebellion, all under the careful watch of women who had become mentors, confidants, and sometimes surrogate parents. The governesses meticulously planned lessons that intertwined literature with moral instruction, mathematics with strategic thinking, and history with the study of character. Every story of kings, queens, generals, and diplomats was presented not merely as entertainment but as a mirror for the children to reflect upon the consequences of decisions, the balance of power, and the virtues of patience and prudence. Meanwhile, nannies and household caregivers managed the more tangible aspects of life, ensuring proper nutrition, monitoring health, and supervising physical activities that strengthened the body in tandem with the mind. Outdoor walks and supervised games in palace gardens became opportunities to teach observation, fairness, cooperation, and the consequences of actions, subtly preparing young royals for the responsibilities and challenges they would face in adulthood. These women understood the importance of emotional intelligence long before the term existed, guiding the children to recognize feelings in themselves and others, to manage frustration, to negotiate disagreements, and to cultivate empathy alongside ambition. In the gilded halls where formal lessons took place, and in the quiet shadows where whispered confidences were shared, the children absorbed patterns of behavior, problem-solving strategies, and social cues that would later become instinctive in high-pressure situations of governance and diplomacy. The bond between caretaker and child deepened during moments of crisis, whether an illness, a stormy temper, or a challenge from siblings or peers. The caregiver's presence provided stability, teaching resilience and composure in the face of discomfort or fear. Their subtle interventions, redirecting attention, offering calm explanations, modeling patience, were often more influential than the overt instruction of parents, who were frequently occupied with political matters, court intrigue, or ceremonial obligations. In the complex microcosm of palace life, young royals learned early that appearances could be deceiving, that words could carry double meanings, and that alliances and loyalties required careful navigation. Governesses and tutors created controlled scenarios where children could experiment, make choices, and experience minor consequences in a safe environment, thereby cultivating judgment, foresight, and discretion. They taught lessons in humility and honor through role-play, storytelling, and reflection, instilling a sense of ethical responsibility that complemented intellectual development. Yet, education was never purely academic or moral. It was deeply personal and relational, emphasizing character formation, emotional balance, and the cultivation of virtues that would sustain a ruler through uncertainty and power struggles. In letters and memoirs, some former pupils recalled the transformative effect of these early relationships: the guidance of a governess during moments of self-doubt, the reassurance of a nurse in the stillness of night, the playful yet instructive encouragement of a nanny in the gardens. Each interaction, no matter how seemingly small, contributed to the development of judgment, confidence, and social intelligence. Even the most trivial seeming routines, preparing for daily audiences, participating in ceremonial processions, or assisting in the care of younger siblings, were carefully monitored by caretakers, who used them as opportunities to teach leadership, patience, and foresight. In the grander context, these women also acted as buffers between the children and the often harsh realities of court intrigue. They shielded them from gossip, protected them from hurtful remarks, and offered counsel on subtle social dynamics. The lessons learned in these moments were internalized, forming a mental toolkit that would allow the future rulers to navigate the treacherous waters of power with both prudence and confidence. The influence of these women extended beyond the emotional and intellectual realms into the practicalities of governance. Knowledge of languages, understanding of trade, negotiation tactics, and early exposure to religious, cultural, and political frameworks were all imparted under their watchful eyes. They ensured that by the time the young royals reached adulthood, they were not only educated in theory but equipped with practical experience in decision-making and observation. Through constant repetition, encouragement, and modeling, they instilled habits of diligence, reflection, and foresight. The daily rhythms, waking with the sun, lessons in the morning, supervised activity in the afternoon, reflection and reading in the evening, were carefully calibrated to cultivate balance, discipline, and adaptability. And yet, amidst all this structure, the women never forgot the importance of emotional warmth. A comforting word, a gentle touch, or the validation of feelings reinforced the sense of security that allowed young royals to take risks in learning, to explore ideas, and to grow without fear of harsh judgment. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the power of these women lay not in titles, privileges, or public recognition, but in the steady, unwavering influence they exercised every day. They nurtured intellect, shaped character, and provided the emotional scaffolding that allowed future kings and queens to thrive. In the silent spaces of palaces, between lessons, bedtime rituals, and whispered conversations, history was being written not only in royal decrees but in the quiet shaping of minds and hearts, guided by women whose names might never be remembered but whose legacies endured in every decision, every act of leadership, and every measure of wisdom exercised by the rulers they had raised. As the years passed, the children who had once clung to the comforting arms of nurses and nannies began to step into adolescence, a period of transformation that tested both their intellect and character. The young princes and princesses, once protected from the complexities of court life, now faced lessons that intertwined education with the subtle currents of power and responsibility. Governesses and tutors adjusted their methods, blending rigorous instruction with delicate guidance in navigating alliances, rivalries, and the nuanced expectations of royal duty. Each day became a balancing act, where the careful cultivation of skill, morality, and emotional resilience was weighed alongside the children's natural impulses, ambitions, and growing awareness of their own privilege. The women who had nurtured them from infancy remained steadfast, now stepping into the role of advisors as well as educators, anticipating challenges that even the royal parents might not have foreseen. In the shadowed corridors and sunlit gardens, lessons extended beyond books and arithmetic to the very nature of human behavior and governance. Young royals were introduced to the consequences of decision-making, the subtleties of negotiation, and the importance of observation. Games of strategy became more than mere play. They were miniature simulations of diplomacy and leadership, with consequences that taught prudence, foresight, and the value of patience. Nannies, meanwhile, continued to anchor daily life, ensuring that routines were maintained, health monitored, and emotional stability preserved. Even as adolescents, the children relied on these women for guidance, comfort, and reassurance, particularly in moments of doubt or anxiety when the enormity of their future roles became apparent. The palace itself, grand and ornate as it was, could be an intimidating place, filled with whispers of intrigue, political maneuvering, and ceremonial obligations. Caretakers acted as buffers, shielding the young royals from unnecessary stress, while subtly preparing them to recognize deception, understand motives, and respond with intelligence and tact. Letters and memoirs from later periods often recall the careful interventions of these women, the gentle correction during moments of impetuosity, the subtle encouragement to observe before acting, and the quiet reinforcement of ethical principles that would later govern critical decisions in war, diplomacy, and governance. Education during this period became intensely practical. Languages, law, history, economics, and military strategy were taught alongside the social graces, ethics, and rituals of courtly life. Governesses orchestrated complex scenarios where young royals could test their judgment, make decisions, and experience minor failures without lasting consequence, cultivating foresight, resilience, and confidence. Emotional intelligence remained a central focus. Young royals were taught to recognize their own emotions, understand the feelings of others, and respond with empathy and wisdom. The daily routines, structured yet flexible, fostered not only intellectual growth but also moral development, enabling the children to integrate knowledge with conscience and ambition with humility. Caretakers also prepared them for the challenges of power. Lessons in discretion, confidentiality, and observation taught the young royals that influence was often exercised quietly and strategically. They learned to listen more than they spoke, to act decisively but thoughtfully, and to appreciate that the outward appearance of authority could mask uncertainty, vulnerability, or opportunity. Beyond formal instruction, the relationships between caretaker and child deepened, forming bonds of trust, loyalty, and respect that would last a lifetime. In the intimate hours of study, reflection, and conversation, these women imparted wisdom, guidance, and insight that extended far beyond the classroom or nursery. They modeled patience, resilience, and moral courage, demonstrating through example what it meant to act with integrity, to navigate complex human interactions, and to balance ambition with compassion. Adolescence also brought moments of crisis, illness, emotional turbulence, and social challenges that tested the children and their mentors alike. In these moments, the women's vigilance, understanding, and foresight proved indispensable, offering guidance, protection, and support that enabled young royals to navigate difficulties with confidence and poise. Through these experiences, the influence of caretakers extended into character formation and leadership preparation. They taught that authority must be exercised with wisdom, that decisions carry weight beyond the immediate, and that the measure of a ruler lies not only in intellect and skill but in empathy, patience, and the ability to inspire loyalty. In reflection, it becomes clear that these hidden figures, often unnamed in chronicles and records, shaped history not through conquest or decree but through the quiet, daily work of nurturing, teaching, and guiding the minds and hearts of those who would one day hold power. The palaces, with their glittering halls, ceremonial pomp, and complex hierarchies, were transformed by these women into spaces of learning, emotional growth, and moral instruction. Their subtle interventions, patient guidance, and unwavering devotion ensured that the future rulers were not only educated and disciplined, but also capable of understanding themselves, others, and the delicate balance of power that defined their world. And as the young royals matured, stepping into roles that demanded judgment, courage, and diplomacy, the legacy of these women remained ever present, quiet, enduring, and invisible to all but those who had been touched by their wisdom, care, and love. In every thoughtful decision, every measured response to challenge, and every act of compassion or strategic insight, the influence of these unseen mentors echoed, demonstrating that the true foundation of leadership often lies not in birthright alone, but in the steady, patient, and enduring guidance of those who raise, teach, and protect. As the royal children crossed the threshold into young adulthood, the world around them expanded in both complexity and consequence. The palaces that had once been nurseries and classrooms became arenas of subtle power, where every gesture, word, and decision carried weight beyond the immediate moment. These young men and women, whose education and character had been shaped meticulously by wet nurses, governesses, and nannies, now began to assume responsibilities that would test not only their intellect but their judgment, resilience, and ethical compass. The women who had guided them from infancy continued their influence, though often in less visible ways. Governesses and tutors transitioned into the role of advisors and confidants, offering insight into political strategies, social alliances, and courtly etiquette that could determine the success or failure of early diplomatic missions. Nannies, once focused on the rhythms of daily care, now provided emotional support, a quiet presence during moments of stress, doubt, or disillusionment, reminding the young royals of the grounding principles instilled over years of careful guidance. Education had matured beyond books and lessons into practice. Young princes and princesses observed and participated in council meetings, witnessed negotiations with foreign dignitaries, and practiced diplomacy under controlled circumstances orchestrated by their mentors. Every interaction was both lesson and test, offering opportunities to apply critical thinking, anticipate consequences, and refine the judgment that would be essential in the governance of nations. In these formative moments, the subtle influence of caretakers became evident in ways both profound and invisible. The patience learned from a governess's measured correction informed calm negotiation, intense diplomatic encounters. The empathy fostered by a nurse's comforting presence guided decisions that balanced justice with mercy. The sense of responsibility instilled through years of structured routines under the watchful eyes of caretakers became the foundation for leadership that was as principled as it was practical. The palace itself, often a labyrinth of intrigue and hierarchical pressure, provided lessons in discretion, perception, and strategy. Young royals learned to navigate courtiers' ambitions, decipher hidden motives, and exercise authority with grace. Caretakers subtly prepared them for these challenges, teaching how to read expressions, understand unspoken communication, and recognize both opportunities and threats in the behavior of others. Even ceremonial duties, once merely rehearsed gestures, now became exercises in observation, interpretation, and social intelligence, as the young royals discerned the subtle power dynamics that could shift alliances and shape reputations. Crisis moments, conflict between siblings, political tension, public scrutiny, or unexpected illness, served as both challenge and opportunity. The women who had nurtured and guided these young royals from childhood provided counsel and stability, reminding them of principles learned over years of careful, patient instruction. Through quiet mentorship, they reinforced the integration of intellect, emotion, and ethics, ensuring that decisions were measured, thoughtful, and informed not only by ambition but by wisdom and compassion. The transition from adolescence to adulthood was marked by increasing visibility, responsibility, and exposure to the harsh realities of power. Yet within this period of growth, the hidden lives of women remained a steady force, guiding, correcting, advising, and nurturing in ways that were often invisible to the wider court yet profoundly impactful on the future rulers. Letters, memoirs, and historical fragments reveal moments of these interventions. The whispered counsel before a critical audience, the discreet reminder of ethical considerations during negotiations, the subtle reinforcement of moral courage in the face of potential compromise. In retrospect, it becomes clear that the ruler's abilities to balance authority with empathy, ambition with prudence, and decisiveness with reflection were rooted deeply in the formative years under the care of these women. The pattern of influence, emotional, intellectual, and moral, traced through childhood and adolescence now matured into strategic foresight, leadership acumen, and resilience in the challenges of early adulthood. Each gesture of guidance, each carefully orchestrated lesson, and each moment of quiet support contributed to a foundation that could withstand the pressures of palace life, court politics, and the heavy expectations of kingship and queenship. Even as the young royals assumed roles of greater responsibility, the presence of these women remained a subtle undercurrent, a reminder of the enduring power of guidance, patience, and devoted mentorship in shaping history not through conquest or decree alone, but through the careful nurturing of character, intellect, and emotional fortitude. And so, as audiences were held, decrees signed, and ceremonies conducted, the invisible influence of wet nurses, governesses, and nannies persisted, a quiet testament to the fact that the foundation of leadership, wisdom, and resilience often lies not in public acclaim but in the unseen hands that guide, nurture, and prepare those destined to shape the course of nations. With the transition into the first true responsibilities of leadership, the young princes and princesses discovered that knowledge and character were only part of what was required to navigate the labyrinthine world of court and kingdom. The women who had nurtured them from infancy, wet nurses, governesses, and nannies, continued to shape their actions, though now through subtle guidance and quiet counsel rather than direct instruction. Every meeting with advisors, every audience with dignitaries, and every decision that touched the lives of hundreds or thousands became a field upon which the lessons of childhood were tested. Governesses, once solely educators, now took on the role of strategic mentors, preparing their wards for the nuances of diplomacy, the weight of judgment, and the balance between principle and pragmatism. They offered insight into human behavior, drawing upon years of careful observation, and reminded the young royals of lessons in patience, discretion, and the subtle use of influence. Meanwhile, nannies and caregivers, whose care had been a constant through sickness, fear, and private triumphs, became emotional anchors, providing stability amid the turbulence of ceremonial obligations and political expectation. Even the smallest guidance, reminding a prince to listen before speaking, encouraging a princess to consider the consequences of a seemingly minor gesture, proved invaluable in the early formation of wise decision-making. The first forays into responsibility were often structured yet fraught with challenge. Young royals were asked to manage small domains, oversee household affairs, or make decisions affecting the welfare of a section of the kingdom. In these exercises, caregivers continued to provide mentorship, ensuring that lessons of fairness, prudence, and ethical reasoning were applied practically. The palace, once a familiar environment of controlled routine, now became a stage for observation, strategy, and subtle testing. Court officials, foreign envoys, and household staff each represented opportunities to apply the principles instilled since infancy. The importance of patience, the necessity of careful listening, the art of timing, and the power of measured words. Even seemingly ceremonial interactions carried lessons, as gestures, tone, and posture communicated as much as spoken words. Caretakers guided the young royals in noticing these subtleties, helping them discern truth from pretense and intent from display. In moments of crisis, whether disputes among courtiers, sudden illness in the palace, or the threat of unrest in the realm, the influence of these women proved most profound. They offered advice on remaining calm under pressure, observing before acting, and integrating moral judgment with practical necessity. Where history records only decisions, decrees, and outcomes, it often omits the invisible scaffolding provided by those who nurtured, instructed, and mentored the rulers behind the scenes. The young royals' ability to navigate complex political landscapes, to act decisively while balancing compassion and justice, was rooted in these decades of careful guidance. Daily routines remained a vital part of this preparation. Morning lessons now blended with practical governance exercises. Afternoons included observations of political assemblies or diplomatic encounters, and evenings were filled with reflection, supervised counsel, and quiet discussions of hypothetical challenges designed to strengthen reasoning and character. These women ensured that the young rulers understood that leadership was not merely a matter of privilege or title, but a responsibility demanding wisdom, empathy, and foresight. Emotional intelligence remained central. Young royals were encouraged to recognize the feelings of those around them, to understand the motivations behind words and actions, and to temper authority with understanding. In private moments, nannies offered comfort and reassurance, while governesses provided mentorship in applying knowledge to real-world situations. The continuity of this guidance created a foundation of stability, allowing the young rulers to act with confidence even amid uncertainty, and to make decisions that reflected both intellect and conscience. Even as the public saw only the polished face of authority, the hidden influence of these women was woven into every measured word, every negotiation, every demonstration of leadership. Their work, silent, patient, and persistent, ensured that the rulers were not only educated in theory but seasoned in judgment, tempered in emotion, and guided by principles cultivated from the earliest days of life. And so, as the young royals faced the first true tests of their ability to lead, their actions carried the imprint of decades of unseen labor. The lullabies of infancy, the corrections of early lessons, the moral guidance of adolescence, and the strategic mentorship of young adulthood. History may remember kings and queens for their power and deeds, but it is within the hidden lives of those who raised them, the women who instructed, nurtured, and guided, that the truest architects of leadership can be found. Every success, every thoughtful decision, and every act of justice was inseparable from the patient, enduring, and invisible influence of those who had devoted their lives to shaping the character, intellect, and heart of a ruler. By the time the young royals fully assumed their early roles in governance, the palaces had become stages of endless lessons in strategy, diplomacy, and human nature. The foundations laid by wet nurses, nannies, and governesses now revealed their full impact, as the rulers faced decisions that carried tangible consequences for thousands of lives. Every audience with advisors or foreign envoys became an exercise in applying the subtleties of human understanding that had been cultivated since infancy. Patience learned from a nurse's gentle care, discretion modeled by a governess during delicate lessons, and empathy instilled in quiet moments of reflection. The women who had guided them remained a quiet but vital presence, offering advice on timing, phrasing, and perspective that could determine the success of negotiations or the resolution of conflicts. Palace life, with its constant pressures, ceremonial demands, and unspoken rivalries, tested every skill the young royals had learned. Caretakers taught them to observe, to notice the shifts in expression, tone, or gesture that might reveal ambition, resentment, or alliance. They reminded their wards that leadership required both decisiveness and reflection, authority tempered with understanding, and ambition balanced with moral integrity. In moments of crisis, disputes among counselors, tension with neighboring territories, or unexpected events that threatened stability, the influence of these unseen women proved crucial. They had prepared the young rulers to respond calmly, to weigh options carefully, and to act with foresight. Even subtle guidance, such as a whispered reminder to pause before replying or a reflective question to consider possible consequences, shaped the trajectory of decisions that history would later remember. Education and mentorship now extended to practical statecraft. Young rulers learned to read maps, study treaties, and analyze economic or military strategies, all under the watchful eyes of those who had nurtured them from infancy. Games and exercises in the nursery, once tools for teaching fairness or cooperation, evolved into simulations of negotiation, alliance formation, and conflict resolution. Every lesson, no matter how small, had been a step toward preparing them for these real-world responsibilities. The emotional foundation built over years ensured that these rulers approached challenges not only with intellect, but with compassion and understanding. They could measure risk against moral obligation, ambition against justice, and strategy against loyalty. Caretakers remained a constant presence in this process, offering counsel without dominating, guidance without intrusion, and encouragement without flattery. Historical accounts may celebrate decrees, victories, and alliances, but the hidden labor of women who shaped the moral, intellectual, and emotional development of these rulers remains largely invisible. Letters and memoirs occasionally capture fleeting glimpses. A nurse comforting a ruler in the solitude of the night, a governess offering advice on a thorny diplomatic decision, or a tutor observing and quietly steering behavior in moments of temptation or haste. Through these interventions, young rulers were equipped not only to act but to act wisely, balancing the often competing demands of power, loyalty, and conscience. Even ceremonial life, with its parades, audiences, and public displays, became an arena for subtle lessons. The young royals learned to project confidence while remaining humble, to demonstrate authority without arrogance, and to understand that the appearance of control was often as important as control itself. Caretakers guided them through these subtleties, reinforcing lessons learned over decades and reminding them that leadership was not solely a function of title or privilege, but of character, insight, and measured action. As alliances formed, crises emerged, and challenges multiplied, the silent influence of these women continued to underpin every choice. Their early instruction in observation, empathy, patience, and judgment now manifested in the practical governance of kingdoms. Through quiet mentorship, careful correction, and unwavering support, they ensured that the rulers were not only capable of wielding power but of wielding it responsibly. And so, as the young monarchs navigated the intricate, often perilous landscape of politics, diplomacy, and governance, history unfolded not only through their actions but through the hidden, enduring influence of those who had raised, taught, and guided them from the earliest moments of life. Every decision, every act of courage, every instance of wisdom bore the imprint of hands and voices that history may never name, yet whose legacy is written indelibly into the story of nations. As the young royals fully embraced the responsibilities of adulthood, the weight of leadership became palpable in every decision, every audience, and every diplomatic engagement. The palaces, once familiar chambers of instruction and play, now served as arenas where the lessons of decades, taught, guided, and nurtured by women who had devoted their lives to their upbringing, were tested in the most consequential ways. Governesses, tutors, and mentors who had guided them from infancy now offered strategic counsel, subtle advice, and quiet reminders of principles learned long before the first audience or council meeting. The young rulers faced not only the complexities of domestic governance, but also the shifting alliances of neighboring territories, the delicate management of public perception, and the constant undercurrent of court intrigue. Each situation demanded a balance of intellect, patience, and emotional wisdom, all qualities carefully instilled by the caregivers whose influence had been both persistent and invisible. Decisions of war and peace, taxation, and policy were navigated with care, guided by the ability to observe subtle cues, anticipate consequences, and weigh the moral implications of action versus inaction. In moments of crisis, the presence of these women, though often unseen, offered stability and perspective. A whisper of counsel, a reminder of historical precedent, or simply the reassurance that moral integrity and prudence could coexist with decisive action, often determined the course of choices that history would record as bold or wise. The daily rhythms of palace life continued to reinforce these lessons. Early mornings brought reflection and study, afternoons were spent in councils, meetings, or inspections, and evenings offered quiet moments of deliberation, often guided by the experienced hand of a mentor or caregiver. Every gesture, tone, and expression was observed and interpreted, not only by courtiers and envoys but by the rulers themselves, trained from childhood to discern subtle meaning and intention. Even seemingly routine activities, attending banquets, receiving ambassadors, or managing ceremonial duties, served as opportunities to practice diplomacy, negotiation, and the art of influence. Nannies and nurses, whose role had long been emotional support and moral guidance, remained vital, providing a steady presence during stressful or uncertain times. Their quiet encouragement, gentle reminders, and unwavering loyalty helped the rulers maintain focus, calm, and empathy, even when the weight of state threatened to overwhelm. Alliances formed and dissolved, treaties were negotiated, and the lives of thousands often hinged on choices made within the palace walls. Yet underlying every decision, every calculated action, was the invisible scaffolding provided by the women who had nurtured these rulers from infancy. Their influence shaped judgment, tempered ambition, and ensured that intellect and morality acted in concert, rather than in opposition. History often celebrates battles won, treaties signed, or policies enacted, but behind every such moment lay decades of instruction, mentorship, and emotional shaping conducted quietly, persistently, and without recognition. The ruler's capacity for empathy, discretion, patience, and strategic thinking, qualities that determine the fate of kingdoms, were deeply rooted in these formative experiences. Even in adulthood, when authority was unquestioned and decisions public, the subtle guidance of these women continued to echo. In moments of doubt, they reminded rulers of lessons learned in childhood, the importance of listening before acting, the value of patience over impulse, and the enduring strength of moral courage alongside political acumen. These women, often unnamed and unrecorded in official chronicles, were the invisible architects of history, shaping decisions that reverberated across generations. Their lives, devoted to nurturing, educating, and guiding future monarchs, were a testament to the enduring power of influence exercised not through command but through care, wisdom, and persistent mentorship. And as the rulers exercised authority, navigated conflict, and forged alliances, they carried within them the accumulated guidance of decades, lessons whispered in nursery halls, modeled in quiet gestures, and reinforced through patient instruction. Every thoughtful decision, every act of leadership, every moment of moral judgment bore the imprint of women whose names history may never recall, yet whose impact shaped the course of kingdoms, the lives of subjects, and the very fabric of nations. The grandeur of palace ceremonies, the weight of political office, and the complexity of diplomacy were inseparable from the foundation laid by caregivers, whose influence ensured that power was wielded not only effectively but wisely, not only decisively but compassionately, and not only for ambition but in service of enduring principles that would define the legacy of rulers for generations to come. As the rulers reached the zenith of their authority, the years of guidance, instruction, and unwavering care provided by wet nurses, governesses, and nannies revealed their full significance. Every decision made in council, every diplomatic negotiation, every decree signed, and every ceremonial gesture performed bore the imprint of decades of mentorship. The lessons in patience, empathy, observation, and moral courage, instilled quietly in the nursery, the classrooms, and the gardens, now manifested in the practice of governance, shaping not only the policies but also the character and legacy of the monarchs. The palace, with its grandeur and intricate hierarchy, had long been a testing ground, a stage where knowledge, judgment, and character were cultivated through careful observation, subtle guidance, and disciplined training. The young royals, now seasoned rulers, carried with them the invisible threads woven by the women who had devoted their lives to their upbringing. Threads that connected intellect with conscience, authority with compassion, and ambition with ethical responsibility. In times of crisis, whether internal political disputes, external threats, or the delicate management of alliances, these rulers relied on the principles ingrained during their formative years. The quiet counsel once offered in whispers by governesses became an internalized voice of reason. The emotional support once provided by nannies transformed into resilience and calm. The lessons of patience, fairness, and discretion, once modeled daily, became instinctive in the practice of leadership. Reflecting on their own journeys, monarchs often recognized, sometimes too late for public acknowledgement, that their successes, temperance, and wisdom were inseparable from the hidden labor of these women. Letters, private diaries, and memoirs occasionally reveal glimpses of gratitude, soft acknowledgments of those who had quietly shaped not only their intellect but their understanding of humanity, responsibility, and moral duty. The legacy of caregivers extended beyond the individual rulers to the very fabric of history. Nations were shaped not only by battles won or laws enacted, but by decisions informed by empathy, foresight, and tempered judgment, qualities cultivated by decades of careful mentorship. Every alliance brokered, every conflict resolved peacefully, every act of justice or mercy bore traces of lessons learned in quiet corridors, sunlit gardens, and softly lit classrooms, where women had guided hands, shaped minds, and nurtured hearts. Even as rulers faced the burdens of state, the complexity of diplomacy, and the scrutiny of court and citizenry, the enduring influence of these unseen women remained a constant undercurrent, reminding them that true power is inseparable from wisdom, compassion, and ethical integrity. In the final reflection, it becomes evident that history, while often recorded in the names of kings and queens, is equally authored by those who remain invisible, the women whose lives were devoted entirely to shaping character, intellect, and resilience in those destined to govern. Their contribution was subtle, patient, and continuous, spanning decades, and yet it was transformative, enduring, and profound. They taught rulers to think critically, to act justly, to feel deeply, and to lead wisely, ensuring that the legacy of power was balanced with responsibility, authority tempered by empathy, and ambition guided by principle. As the sun set on palace gardens and corridors, and the chambers once filled with the laughter, curiosity, and learning of children grew quiet, the unseen presence of these women remained embedded in every decision, every act of governance, and every measure of history shaped by their wards. Their labor was hidden from public view, yet its effects were monumental, a testament to the enduring power of care, guidance, and mentorship in shaping not only rulers but the destiny of nations. And so, the story of the hidden lives of women who raised royal children concludes not with fanfare, but with the quiet recognition that true influence often lies not in visibility, titles, or public acclaim, but in the persistent, patient, and loving work of those who devote themselves to nurturing the leaders of tomorrow, ensuring that the course of history is guided by wisdom, integrity, and the enduring human values quietly instilled in the hearts and minds of those who rule. By the time the rulers had fully stepped into the responsibilities of adult sovereignty, the palace corridors echoed not only with ceremonial splendor but with the quiet tension of political maneuvering, strategic calculation, and the weight of decisions affecting thousands of lives. Every day demanded measured thought, patience, and discernment, qualities that had been carefully instilled by the women who had guided them from infancy. Governesses and tutors, whose role had long evolved into mentorship, now functioned as silent strategists, offering subtle advice on negotiation, alliance building, and the ethical dimensions of rulership. Nannies and nurses, whose presence had once been primarily emotional and practical, continued to provide grounding and stability, reminding rulers that wisdom, composure, and empathy were as essential as intellect in guiding a kingdom. The young monarchs confronted crises that tested every lesson imparted over years of careful upbringing. Conflicts between rival court factions, disputes among neighboring states, threats to trade and security, and the delicate management of public perception. In each instance, the rulers drew upon the emotional intelligence nurtured in childhood, learning to read unspoken cues, anticipate hidden motives, and respond with measured authority rather than impulsive reaction. Even routine audiences and ceremonial duties became exercises in diplomacy and observation, teaching that appearances and gestures could carry as much significance as words, and that the subtleties of expression often revealed true intent. Caretakers guided their wards to perceive these nuances, to act with prudence, and to balance power with moral responsibility. Decisions regarding war and peace, taxation, succession, and law were fraught with complexity, and in navigating them, rulers relied on internalized lessons of justice, fairness, patience, and foresight imparted by the women who had raised them. In moments of doubt or pressure, the quiet influence of these mentors acted as both counsel and reassurance, a reminder that thoughtful reflection, ethical reasoning, and empathy could coexist with decisive action and political necessity. The daily rhythms of palace life, study, observation, counsel, reflection, continued to reinforce these lessons. Even the grandest state occasions and public ceremonies were opportunities for young rulers to practice measured judgment, strategic communication, and the subtle exercise of authority. The preparation that had begun in infancy, through lullabies, games, and structured instruction, now manifested as instinctive understanding of human nature, power dynamics, and the responsibilities of leadership. Private letters, diaries, and memoirs of later life reveal glimpses of this invisible scaffolding. Recollections of whispered advice before critical meetings, reminders to pause before acting in moments of tension, and subtle encouragement to maintain moral integrity, even when temptation or pressure threatened to compromise judgment. These traces illuminate the profound influence of caretakers who, though largely unrecognized in historical records, shaped the very decisions that define nations. As monarchs navigated the complex terrain of diplomacy, they applied lessons learned in gardens, nurseries, and classrooms, the patience of a governess, the observation skills modeled in early play, and the empathy nurtured by Nanny's care. Each act of negotiation, treaty formulation, or conflict resolution carried echoes of these early teachings. Even when public recognition focused on the ruler alone, every successful alliance, every carefully weighed policy, and every act of justice bore the invisible imprint of women whose devotion, guidance, and insight had been unwavering for decades. The influence of these unseen figures extended beyond immediate governance into the long-term stability of kingdoms. By cultivating moral and emotional strength alongside intellectual acumen, they ensured that rulers could endure crises, make ethical decisions under pressure, and inspire loyalty and respect among subjects and allies alike. These women, whose names are often absent from official chronicles, were the architects of legacy, embedding in their wards a capacity for principled authority, measured ambition, and compassionate leadership. And as the rulers matured, their decisions, strategies, and actions continued to reflect a balance between power and responsibility, ambition and ethics, a balance cultivated, shaped, and nurtured from the earliest moments of life by those whose work remained largely invisible, but whose impact was enduring, profound, and inseparable from the course of history itself. As the monarch's authority solidified, their reigns were tested by events that demanded not only intellect and strategy, but also resilience, foresight, and moral judgment. Crises emerged in the form of rebellions, contested successions, territorial disputes, and the constant pressures of court intrigue, each requiring a measured response informed by decades of careful mentorship. The women who had shaped these rulers from infancy remained an unseen yet vital presence, providing guidance through subtle counsel, quiet reflection, and the reinforcement of principles instilled long ago. Governesses, now senior advisors, reminded their wards of lessons in patience, observation, and ethical discernment, helping them navigate negotiations that could determine the fate of entire regions. Nannies and nurses offered a stabilizing influence during moments of personal doubt, illness, or emotional fatigue, ensuring that rulers maintained composure and perspective amid the relentless demands of sovereignty. Every decision, whether related to alliances, war, or domestic governance, drew upon skills cultivated from early childhood. The ability to read hidden motives, to anticipate consequences, to weigh justice against pragmatism, and to act with courage tempered by conscience. Palace ceremonies, council meetings, and diplomatic exchanges became arenas where these skills were exercised daily. Subtle gestures, measured words, and careful observation of body language informed choices as much as formal treaties and written advice. The monarchs, trained from infancy to integrate intellect with emotion, strategy with empathy, applied these lessons instinctively, often without conscious acknowledgement of the countless hours of guidance that had shaped them. In moments of intense crisis, an unexpected rebellion, a sudden betrayal, or the delicate balance of competing alliances, the silent influence of caregivers became particularly evident. Advice offered in whispers during early life, emotional resilience nurtured through attentive care, and moral reasoning modeled over years now guided rulers' decisions, allowing them to act decisively yet justly. These women ensured that the exercise of power was never divorced from principle, that authority was always tempered by empathy, and that ambition was balanced with responsibility. Historical records, which often emphasize battles won, treaties signed, or policies enacted, rarely capture the subtle architecture of influence behind these moments. Yet letters, diaries, and anecdotal memoirs occasionally reveal traces. The quiet counsel before a critical decision, the reflective questions posed in private that shaped judgment, and the emotional support that sustained composure under pressure. Through these unseen contributions, caregivers shaped outcomes that affected not only their immediate wards but the fate of kingdoms, the well-being of populations, and the arc of history itself. Even in triumph, rulers remained mindful of the values instilled by those who had nurtured them. Patience in negotiation, empathy in judgment, discretion in speech, and integrity in action. The intricate lessons of childhood, woven through play, instruction, emotional support, and guidance, manifested as the capacity to balance power with compassion, strategy with morality, and public duty with personal virtue. Alliances were formed with wisdom, conflicts resolved with discernment, and governance exercised with both authority and humility. And throughout, the invisible presence of these women persisted. A quiet guiding force whose influence, though unrecorded in grand chronicles, was embedded in the very fabric of decisions, policies, and leadership that shaped generations. The legacy of these caretakers endured not in monuments or titles but in the enduring stability, ethical grounding, and thoughtful governance of rulers they had raised, proving that the hidden labor of women had, for centuries, been a cornerstone of history itself. As the years of reign unfolded, monarchs found themselves facing moments that would define not only their personal legacies, but the fate of entire kingdoms. Decisions about war, diplomacy, succession, and domestic policy carried weight beyond immediate perception, and the pressure of history rested heavily on their shoulders. Yet in every choice, every counsel given, every strategy devised, the invisible guidance of those who had nurtured them from infancy remained a quiet but constant influence. Governesses and tutors whose teachings had evolved into mentorship offered subtle reminders of the principles that underpinned effective and ethical leadership, drawing upon decades of careful observation, instruction, and moral shaping. Nannies and wet nurses, whose presence had long provided emotional stability, now contributed to resilience, patience, and the capacity to act with calm determination, even under extraordinary stress. The lessons of childhood, patient correction, structured learning, moral guidance, and emotional nurturing, manifested in the ability to weigh ambition against justice, authority against empathy, and decisive action against reflection. Even as monarchs navigated the complexities of alliances, rebellions, and international negotiation, they relied upon instincts and judgment shaped by unseen hands. The quiet counsel, the modeled patience, the early instruction in observation and moral reasoning that had been woven into their character from the first days of life. In moments of triumph or crisis, rulers often reflected, consciously or unconsciously, on the values instilled by these women. The importance of fairness, the necessity of understanding human motives, the power of listening before speaking, and the enduring strength that comes from moral courage. Historical records may emphasize treaties signed, battles won, or policies enacted, but the true architecture of leadership was built in the invisible classrooms of palace nurseries, gardens, and private chambers, where these women had spent years cultivating intellect, emotional intelligence, and moral discernment. Even as public attention celebrated the rulers themselves, every act of diplomacy, every resolution of conflict, and every example of ethical governance bore the quiet imprint of decades of unseen mentorship. The impact of these women extended far beyond individual rulers. By shaping the judgment, character, and resilience of those in power, they influenced the course of kingdoms, the fate of subjects, and the trajectory of history itself. Their work, though largely unrecorded, ensured that power was exercised with wisdom, ambition balanced with principle, and authority tempered by empathy. In reflective moments, monarchs recognized that the stability of their reigns, the respect of allies, and the trust of their people were inseparable from the guidance received in childhood and adolescence. The lullabies sung in quiet nurseries, the carefully orchestrated lessons of ethics and strategy, the patient reinforcement of emotional intelligence, and the moral guidance offered through daily life had formed the bedrock of decisions made under the pressure of statecraft. The hidden lives of these women, nurturers, educators, and silent architects of character, prove that influence does not require public recognition to be profound, enduring, and transformative. As rulers aged and kingdoms prospered or weathered storms, the unseen contributions of their caregivers persisted, woven into the decisions, actions, and moral compass of those who held power. Ultimately, history remembers the rulers, their decrees, and their victories, but it is within the patient, enduring, and invisible labor of the women who raised them that the deepest legacies reside. Through decades of nurturing intellect, character, and resilience, these women ensured that rulers could wield power not only effectively but ethically, not only strategically but compassionately, and not only with authority but with humanity. And as the sun set on palace gardens, ceremonial halls, and council chambers, the silent influence of these women, whose lives were devoted to shaping the hearts and minds of future leaders, remained embedded in every act of governance, every measure of justice, and every historical moment, a testament to the quiet yet enduring power of care, guidance, and unwavering mentorship that shaped the course of nations across generations. Even as the monarchs settled into the early years of their rule, the shadows of their caregivers' guidance continued to shape every decision. Childhood lessons in observation, patience, and subtle communication now manifested in the careful reading of courtiers' intentions, the measured conduct of ambassadors, and the thoughtful handling of delicate familial tensions. Wet nurses and nannies, whose role had once been to soothe, feed, and comfort, now subtly influenced emotional resilience, teaching rulers how to maintain composure under scrutiny and to respond to provocation with wisdom rather than impulse. Governesses, tutors, and mentors provided frameworks for strategic thinking, encouraging rulers to anticipate the consequences of both immediate action and long-term policy. In the solitude of private chambers, rulers reflected on these lessons, recognizing the unseen hands that had built the foundation of their judgment, their ethical reasoning, and their ability to lead with compassion and clarity. Palace corridors, gardens, and sunlit halls became arenas for learning far beyond formal instruction, spaces where observation of human behavior, quiet testing of patience, and the practice of empathy were as integral to governance as the lessons of law, strategy, or literature. These extended years of mentorship, often invisible to the public eye, ensured that rulers approached governance with a blend of intellect, emotional intelligence, and moral conscience, each decision echoing the patient guidance of women who had devoted their lives to shaping their wards. As political responsibilities increased, young monarchs faced the realities of court intrigue, alliances, and rival factions. Every diplomatic negotiation carried consequences beyond the immediate, and even seemingly minor gestures could shift loyalties or provoke conflict. The caretaker's influence, cultivated over decades, proved indispensable. Lessons in discretion, observation, and moral reasoning guided rulers through tense assemblies, debates, and unexpected challenges. Emotional grounding provided by nannies and wet nurses helped sustain clarity amid stress, while the analytical frameworks provided by governesses allowed the monarchs to weigh options carefully. Subtle testing, introduced in childhood games, lessons in negotiation, and staged moral dilemmas, manifested in strategic decision-making. Even the smallest details, such as how to phrase a decree, when to pause before answering a question, or how to interpret nonverbal cues, were rooted in early, patient instruction. This invisible scaffolding ensured that rulers acted not only with intelligence, but with empathy, integrity, and foresight, shaping the course of their kingdoms in ways largely unseen but profoundly effective. With time, the monarchs began to encounter crises that demanded both courage and moral fortitude. Rebellions, disputes with neighboring rulers, and internal unrest tested every skill instilled during years of careful mentorship. Governesses advised on strategy and long-term consequences, while nannies and wet nurses provided reminders of ethical principles and emotional stability. In the midst of conflict, rulers relied on instincts developed through decades of guided observation, reflection, and quiet correction. The lessons of childhood, the importance of patience, the recognition of subtle social cues, and the cultivation of moral judgment, manifested in the careful negotiation of peace treaties, the resolution of disputes, and the management of succession matters. Even ceremonial acts, public appearances, and the presentation of authority carried layers of subtle strategy, honed over years of invisible instruction. These formative influences ensured that leadership was exercised responsibly, ethically, and effectively, even under the most trying circumstances. As alliances were forged and rivalries endured, the young monarchs increasingly relied on the wisdom of those who had nurtured them. Governesses and mentors provided frameworks for long-term strategy, encouraging rulers to consider not only immediate outcomes but generational consequences. Emotional resilience, a gift of caregivers, allowed them to endure criticism, manage stress, and maintain focus on the broader vision for their realms. In quiet moments of reflection, rulers often revisited the lessons of their formative years, recognizing the invisible threads that connected their decisions to decades of guidance. From the structured lessons in ethics and observation to the subtle moral instruction embedded in daily care, every aspect of childhood and adolescence informed governance, diplomacy, and leadership. The enduring influence of these women became evident in decisions that balanced authority with empathy, ambition with prudence, and power with moral responsibility, ensuring the long-term stability and prosperity of the kingdom. Years into their rule, monarchs faced challenges that would define both their reigns and their legacies. Wars, famine, political intrigue, and the burden of expectation demanded wisdom, courage, and moral clarity. In these moments, the guidance of their caregivers, though largely invisible to historians and subjects, shaped every response. Early lessons in patience, empathy, and observation allowed rulers to discern motives, anticipate consequences, and act decisively yet ethically. Caretakers' lifelong instruction in moral reasoning, emotional intelligence, and strategic thinking became the foundation for handling crises with calm judgment. The integration of intellect and conscience, cultivated over decades, enabled rulers to govern with both efficiency and humanity, demonstrating that the unseen labor of women in their upbringing was a central pillar of history, embedded in decisions, policies, and the stability of entire kingdoms. As monarchs reflected on their own journeys, the legacy of the women who had raised them became increasingly clear. Every thoughtful decision, measured response, and act of justice bore the imprint of silent mentorship. The lessons of childhood, modeled in small gestures, reinforced through structured instruction, and nurtured through decades of care, manifested in adult leadership marked by wisdom, empathy, and ethical consideration. Even in the midst of complex diplomacy, political tension, or personal doubt, rulers drew strength and insight from these early influences. Memoirs, letters, and chronicles occasionally hint at these connections, acknowledging the unseen architects of character, judgment, and emotional resilience. The impact of caregivers extended far beyond the individual, shaping the governance of kingdoms, the outcomes of alliances, and the lives of countless subjects, ensuring that history was molded not only by birthright or authority, but by the patient, enduring guidance of women whose influence was profound yet hidden. Finally, as the years of reign matured into a legacy, the rulers fully recognized the lasting imprint of their caregivers. The moral compass, strategic insight, emotional resilience, and ethical judgment that guided every decision were built upon the decades of instruction, mentorship, and nurturing received from wet nurses, nannies, and governesses. While history often recorded the deeds of kings and queens, the invisible labor of these women, the patient correction, the quiet counsel, the emotional support, and the moral guidance, was the true foundation upon which leadership was exercised. In the closing reflections of a long reign, rulers acknowledged, at least privately, that their capacity to govern wisely, to lead compassionately, and to navigate the complexities of human behavior was inseparable from the invisible hands that had shaped them from the earliest days of life. The story of the hidden lives of women who raised royal children concludes not with public recognition, but with the enduring impact of care, wisdom, and mentorship, a legacy embedded in the decisions, character, and history of rulers whose lives and nations were forever transformed by their guidance. Morning light filtered gently through tall palace windows, casting soft ribbons of gold across polished stone floors and embroidered tapestries that carried centuries of silent memory. And in this quiet glow the rhythm of royal life began once more, guided not by the echo of trumpets or the formality of court rituals, but by the invisible structure established long ago by the women who had shaped every habit, every instinct, and every emotional response of the rulers. Even now, in adulthood, the monarch's day unfolded according to patterns learned in childhood. Moments of reflection before speech, deliberate pacing in decision-making, careful observation of faces and tone before forming judgments, and a steady internal calm that allowed the mind to remain clear amid constant responsibility. These qualities were not born of chance or temperament alone but were patiently cultivated through years of gentle correction, quiet example, and persistent emotional grounding offered by nurses, governesses, and attendants who had once guided tiny hands across writing slates, soothed restless nights, and introduced the first lessons of discipline and empathy. The palace itself seemed to remember them, as if every corridor retained echoes of whispered encouragements and slow measured footsteps that once accompanied young learners during their first explorations of power, duty, and restraint. In council chambers where political tension often simmered beneath polished courtesy, the monarch listened more than spoke, absorbing subtle shifts in posture and tone, a skill originally learned while watching caregivers navigate the complex social hierarchy of palace staff, observing how respect, authority, and kindness could coexist without conflict. These early observations had taught the child to perceive intention behind expression, motive behind silence, and sincerity behind ritual, creating a ruler capable of understanding human complexity rather than reducing governance to rigid rules or impulsive reaction. In moments of pause between deliberations, memories surfaced not as sharp images but as emotional textures. The warmth of a guiding hand during difficult lessons, the calm voice that encouraged patience rather than haste, the steady reassurance that mistakes were not failures but pathways to wisdom. And these internal echoes functioned as silent advisors long after the physical presence of caregivers had faded into the background of history. The monarch's relationship with time itself had been shaped by those early years, learning that true progress unfolds gradually, that rushed decisions often carry unseen consequences, and that endurance is strengthened through consistency rather than dramatic force. When disputes arose among advisors or nobles, the ruler instinctively allowed space for voices to unfold fully before intervening, echoing the method once used by governesses who encouraged thoughtful discussion rather than immediate correction, teaching the child to value understanding over dominance. Even the way documents were reviewed reflected early discipline. Slow, careful reading, attention to nuance, and deliberate confirmation of intent before signing, habits formed through countless childhood exercises designed to sharpen patience and accuracy rather than speed alone. Beyond the formal duties of governance, the quieter hours of the day revealed even deeper traces of early nurturing. Walking through palace gardens at dusk, the monarch often slowed instinctively, noticing patterns of light, the soft movement of leaves, and the subtle changes in air temperature, a sensitivity cultivated during childhood walks guided by caretakers who taught awareness of environment as a pathway to inner calm and reflection. These sensory habits grounded the ruler emotionally, allowing the nervous system to reset after long hours of political strain, reinforcing mental clarity and emotional balance essential for sustainable leadership. The caregivers had never framed these lessons as preparation for rulership. Instead, they had embedded them into ordinary moments of daily life, allowing wisdom to grow naturally rather than through forced instruction. During private meals, the ruler maintained mindful pacing, savoring rather than rushing, Another behavioral echo from early years when caregivers emphasized moderation, gratitude, and respect for nourishment as symbolic of respect for life itself. Even interactions with servants reflected a consistent dignity and courtesy rooted in childhood modeling, where nurses demonstrated respect regardless of rank, teaching the young royal that authority carried responsibility rather than entitlement. This invisible ethical framework permeated governance, influencing policies that balanced efficiency with humanity, discipline with compassion, and authority with restraint. At night, when palace halls grew quiet and torches flickered against stone walls, the monarch often experienced a subtle emotional softness, a gentle slowing of thought reminiscent of bedtime routines once guided by nannies who used rhythm, low voices, and calming structure to prepare the child for rest. This internal rhythm remained embedded in the nervous system, enabling the ruler to transition from intensity to calm without agitation, a rare capacity among those burdened with constant responsibility. In these quiet hours, reflections surfaced naturally. Memories of early instruction, of patient correction after mistakes, of emotional reassurance during uncertainty, and of encouragement toward curiosity and moral questioning, rather than blind obedience. These recollections were not sentimental distractions but functional cognitive anchors that reinforced stability, humility, and long-term perspective. The monarch understood, even if only subconsciously, that leadership was not sustained through dominance or fear, but through coherence of character, emotional regulation, and ethical consistency, all cultivated during the invisible apprenticeship of childhood. Across the kingdom, subjects experienced the benefits of this internal stability through fair governance, predictable policy, measured response to crisis, and consistent moral tone that fostered public trust and institutional continuity. Yet few could perceive the origin of these qualities, assuming them to be inherent royal traits rather than the product of decades of quiet mentorship performed by women whose lives remained largely undocumented. In times of external threat, the ruler's calm clarity prevented panic from spreading through court and military command, allowing coordinated response rather than chaotic reaction, a psychological resilience rooted in early emotional regulation taught by caregivers who gently guided the child through frustration, fear, and disappointment without shame or harshness. During diplomatic negotiations, the ruler's ability to tolerate ambiguity, delay gratification, and maintain strategic patience reflected countless childhood exercises designed to strengthen impulse control and reflective thinking. Even the capacity to endure loneliness, a common burden of high authority, had been strengthened through early independence training balanced with emotional security, preventing the ruler from seeking validation through reckless alliances or emotional dependency. The caregivers had quietly prepared the nervous system, the cognitive structure, and the ethical compass long before political responsibilities emerged, shaping a leader capable of long-term coherence rather than short-term reaction. As seasons passed and years accumulated, these internal patterns deepened rather than faded, reinforcing stability with maturity rather than erosion, demonstrating that early guidance compounds over time rather than dissolves. The palace remained a living environment of layered memory, where each stone corridor seemed to carry the quiet residue of formative years, reinforcing continuity between past and present. Even new generations of young royals entering the nursery unknowingly benefited from systems designed by previous caregivers, inheriting structured routines, emotional safeguards, and educational philosophies refined through decades of lived experience rather than abstract theory. Thus, the influence of these women extended not only through individual rulers, but through institutional memory embedded in palace culture itself. The monarch often observed young heirs moving through early lessons and recognized familiar patterns. The same gentle correction methods, the same rhythm of structured freedom, the same emphasis on empathy, curiosity, and discipline, all inherited from invisible architects whose lives rarely entered official chronicles. This recognition created a quiet internal gratitude, not expressed publicly but carried as a private awareness of intergenerational continuity, shaped by care rather than power. Leadership, in this deeper sense, was revealed not as an isolated achievement, but as a cumulative inheritance of emotional intelligence, ethical stability, and cognitive discipline transmitted silently through generations of caregiving women whose names were forgotten, but whose impact remained embedded in the living behavior of rulers and institutions alike. And so, within the daily flow of governance, diplomacy, reflection, and quiet solitude, the invisible presence of these women continued to guide the rhythm of history, shaping not only decisions but the internal architecture of leadership itself, ensuring that power remained anchored to patience, clarity, empathy, and long-term wisdom, rather than impulse or fear. As the rhythm of seasons continued to cycle through the palace grounds, the monarch's inner landscape matured alongside the external stability of the realm, revealing how deeply the architecture of childhood training shaped the capacity to navigate change without losing internal equilibrium. Subtle shifts in political climate, economic pressure, and diplomatic tension required constant recalibration of priorities, yet the ruler moved through these adjustments with deliberate steadiness rather than reactive urgency, a behavioral pattern rooted in early lessons that emphasized emotional regulation, reflective pause, and gradual assessment before action. These habits were cultivated long before authority ever arrived. During quiet nursery moments when caregivers taught patience through gentle repetition, encouraged curiosity through calm explanation, and modeled composure even when challenges arose. The nervous system had learned safety in structure, predictability in routine, and trust in thoughtful response, enabling the adult ruler to maintain clarity under pressure without suppressing emotional awareness. During council sessions where multiple advisors presented conflicting perspectives, the monarch demonstrated an ability to hold complexity without immediate resolution, allowing divergent viewpoints to coexist until deeper patterns emerged, echoing childhood practices where governesses encouraged layered thinking rather than binary judgment. This tolerance for ambiguity strengthened strategic decision-making, preventing impulsive commitments and enabling long-range planning grounded in realism rather than optimism or fear. The monarch's communication style carried the imprint of early language modeling, favoring measured tone, precise vocabulary, and respectful pacing, qualities that reduced escalation during negotiations and fostered mutual trust across cultural boundaries. Even moments of disagreement were handled with controlled emotional presence, avoiding humiliation or dominance, preserving relational stability that supported long-term cooperation rather than short-term compliance. Outside formal governance, private moments of solitude allowed the ruler to maintain internal alignment, often revisiting familiar walking paths within palace gardens or quiet chambers where natural light softened stone walls and diffused mental tension. These spaces activated sensory memory associated with childhood regulation routines, reinforcing calm focus and emotional balance essential for sustainable leadership. The monarch instinctively synchronized breathing with walking pace, an embodied pattern originally introduced by caregivers who used rhythm and gentle pacing to stabilize young nervous systems during moments of stress or fatigue. This physiological coherence translated directly into cognitive clarity, supporting ethical reasoning and strategic foresight without emotional distortion. In correspondence with distant allies, the ruler expressed consistency of tone and moral framing, ensuring continuity of trust across time and distance, a discipline rooted in early training in integrity and accountability, rather than convenience or image management. When confronted with public criticism or unexpected failure, emotional resilience prevented defensive reaction, allowing measured correction rather than reactive justification, reinforcing institutional credibility and social stability. These capacities were not inherent traits but cumulative results of thousands of micro-interactions during formative years when caregivers modeled emotional safety, accountability, curiosity, and disciplined reflection. The palace functioned as a living ecosystem of these principles, transmitting behavioral continuity across generations through structured routines, relational modeling, and subtle reinforcement rather than formal doctrine. Younger royals observed leadership behaviors long before assuming responsibility, absorbing emotional regulation, ethical posture, and relational intelligence through proximity rather than instruction, continuing the silent lineage of caregiving influence embedded in palace culture. Even changes in staff rarely disrupted this continuity, because the underlying behavioral architecture had become institutionalized rather than dependent on individuals alone. As the monarch navigated periods of uncertainty such as market fluctuations, border tensions, or succession planning, the capacity to remain emotionally anchored prevented the amplification of fear across the court and citizenry, preserving confidence and social cohesion. The ruler's calm presence functioned as a regulatory signal for the entire governance system, stabilizing collective behavior through consistent emotional tone and transparent reasoning. This effect mirrored early childhood attachment dynamics, where caregiver calm regulated the developing nervous system, now scaled upward to stabilize complex social networks across an entire kingdom. The emotional intelligence embedded in leadership prevented unnecessary escalation of conflict and allowed flexible adaptation to evolving conditions without compromising ethical integrity. Over time, these patterns accumulated into a recognizable leadership identity characterized by trustworthiness, consistency, and measured authority, rather than spectacle or dominance. Citizens experienced governance as predictable and fair, reducing social volatility and increasing cooperative engagement across economic and cultural boundaries. Yet the deeper origin of this stability remained largely invisible, residing in the early years of emotional scaffolding constructed by women whose labor unfolded quietly behind palace walls. In moments of reflection, the monarch occasionally recognized how much of personal stability was inherited rather than consciously built, acknowledging internally the unseen hands that had shaped perception, impulse control, moral orientation, and emotional resilience long before responsibility arrived. These realizations carried humility rather than nostalgia, reinforcing the understanding that leadership is an intergenerational transmission of care, discipline, and wisdom, rather than an individual achievement. As evening settled and palace lights softened into warm constellations along stone corridors, the ruler transitioned naturally into restorative quiet, allowing the nervous system to decompress without cognitive strain, preserving long-term clarity and psychological sustainability. This capacity for recovery prevented burnout and cognitive rigidity, enabling adaptive leadership across decades rather than years. And so, within the gentle continuity of daily governance, reflection, and embodied regulation, the invisible architecture of caregiving continued to shape history not through dramatic events but through sustained stability, ethical coherence, and emotional intelligence that quietly guided the trajectory of the realm, proving once again that the deepest forces shaping leadership often operate far beneath the surface of public recognition and recorded legacy. As years accumulated and governance settled into a steady rhythm, the monarch began to experience leadership less as a series of dramatic decisions and more as an ongoing process of alignment between inner stability and external complexity, a balance quietly cultivated through decades of early caregiving that emphasized emotional coherence, ethical consistency, and reflective awareness rather than reactive control. Subtle shifts in generational expectations, cultural values, and technological adaptation required nuanced calibration rather than rigid preservation of tradition, and the ruler navigated these transitions with thoughtful openness rather than defensive resistance, a capacity rooted in early experiences where caregivers encouraged curiosity, adaptive learning, and respectful questioning instead of blind obedience. The nervous system, conditioned through consistent emotional safety in childhood, tolerated novelty without triggering threat responses, allowing exploration and innovation to coexist with continuity and prudence. In council dialogues addressing infrastructure development, education reform, and trade modernization, the monarch demonstrated the ability to integrate multiple time horizons simultaneously, weighing immediate benefit against long-term consequence, social impact against economic efficiency, and moral responsibility against political feasibility. This integrative cognition mirrored early training where governesses guided the child to consider layered outcomes in storytelling exercises, strategic games, and ethical discussions that strengthened systems thinking long before governance demanded it. The ruler's ability to synthesize complexity without fragmentation allowed policies to evolve gradually, preserving social stability while enabling adaptive growth. Even during public addresses, communication maintained grounded clarity rather than emotional manipulation, reinforcing trust through transparency rather than spectacle. Another behavioral imprint inherited from caregivers who modeled authentic emotional expression rather than performative authority. In private reflection, the monarch often recognized how deeply perception itself had been shaped by early relational experience, how the lens through which power, responsibility, and human behavior were interpreted was not self-generated but carefully scaffolded through thousands of patient interactions during formative years. These realizations deepen humility and reduce the impulse toward ego-driven governance, reinforcing service orientation rather than dominance orientation as the psychological foundation of authority. Younger advisors and emerging leaders observed this posture and unconsciously mirrored its tone, extending the influence of caregiving principles beyond the royal household into broader administrative culture. The palace gradually functioned less as a hierarchical power structure and more as a regulated ecosystem of relational intelligence, where emotional stability, ethical consistency, and thoughtful deliberation guided institutional behavior across departments and generations. During periods of societal tension triggered by resource scarcity or regional instability, the monarch's capacity to remain emotionally centered prevented polarization from dominating discourse, allowing collaborative problem-solving rather than factional escalation. This stabilizing presence echoed early attachment dynamics where caregivers regulated emotional states through calm presence rather than control, now scaled to govern collective nervous systems across communities. The ruler's consistent response patterns generated predictability that reduced anxiety among citizens and institutions alike, enabling cooperation even under uncertainty. In moments of solitude, sensory rituals once embedded in childhood resurfaced naturally. Slow breathing patterns, rhythmic walking, reflective silence, and gentle observation of natural cycles, each reinforcing physiological coherence and cognitive clarity. These embodied practices sustained long-term mental health and decision quality, preventing exhaustion-driven distortion of judgment. Even the capacity to tolerate loneliness, ambiguity, and delayed gratification traced directly to early emotional scaffolding that balanced secure attachment with autonomy development. The caregivers had created psychological architecture capable of sustaining complexity without fragmentation, enabling leadership that remained adaptive, ethical, and emotionally stable across decades of responsibility. As generational transitions approached and succession planning became increasingly relevant, the monarch applied the same principles inwardly, ensuring that young heirs were exposed not only to academic instruction but to emotional modeling, reflective dialogue, and relational stability that would prepare their nervous systems for future authority long before formal power arrived. Observing the nursery routines and early mentorship structures reaffirmed the ruler's understanding that leadership begins not in policy chambers, but in quiet moments of emotional safety, curiosity cultivation, and moral modeling. The continuity of caregiving culture preserved institutional wisdom across time, preventing erosion of ethical foundations even as social structures evolved. Through this silent transmission, the legacy of unseen women extended far beyond individual biographies, shaping collective intelligence and emotional maturity at the structural level of governance itself. And so, as the kingdom gradually adapted to changing realities while maintaining coherence and trust, the invisible labor of caregivers continued to function as the stabilizing foundation beneath visible authority, demonstrating once more that the deepest engines of history operate through sustained care, emotional intelligence, and ethical continuity rather than spectacle or conquest. As the monarch entered the later phase of mature leadership, the texture of responsibility subtly transformed from active construction toward sustained stewardship, where the primary task was no longer rapid expansion or reform but the preservation of balance, institutional coherence, and generational continuity, a transition made possible only because the internal foundations of emotional regulation, ethical clarity, and cognitive stability had been deeply embedded during early caregiving years. Decision-making slowed not from hesitation but from wisdom, allowing deeper pattern recognition and long-range calibration rather than reactive urgency, reflecting childhood lessons that emphasize patience, sequencing, and incremental understanding over impulsive resolution. The ruler increasingly perceived governance as an ecosystem rather than a hierarchy, recognizing how small relational signals propagated through administrative networks, markets, military structures, and cultural institutions, an awareness originally cultivated through early observational training, where caregivers encouraged noticing cause and effect dynamics within social interactions and natural environments. This system's perspective enabled subtle adjustments rather than disruptive interventions, stabilizing the realm through quiet calibration rather than dramatic enforcement. Public trust deepened as citizens experienced consistent emotional tone, transparent reasoning, and predictable ethical boundaries in leadership behavior, reducing social volatility and strengthening cooperative identity across communities. The monarch's presence functioned as a regulatory anchor, calming collective anxiety during economic fluctuation or environmental uncertainty through steady communication rather than fear-based messaging. This stabilizing capacity echoed the earliest attachment experiences where caregiver calm regulated infant nervous systems, now expanded across entire populations through leadership tone and behavioral consistency. In private moments, the ruler reflected on the gradual softening of ambition into responsibility, recognizing that legacy was no longer measured by visible achievement, but by the durability of institutional health, the emotional maturity of emerging leaders, and the ethical continuity transmitted across generations. These reflections carried quiet gratitude toward the women who had shaped emotional intelligence, impulse regulation, and moral reasoning long before authority arrived, acknowledging internally that leadership maturity was an inherited architecture rather than an isolated accomplishment. The palace nursery once again became a symbolic focal point as new heirs began early learning cycles, guided by routines refined across decades of caregiving experience, embedding emotional safety, curiosity, and reflective discipline into developing nervous systems. Observing these interactions reaffirmed the monarch's understanding that the future stability of the realm depended less on policy than on the quality of early relational environments shaping future leaders. Even subtle aspects such as tone of voice, pacing of instruction, response to error, and modeling of empathy carried long-term implications for cognitive flexibility, moral orientation, and stress resilience. The ruler encouraged continuity of these caregiving principles, protecting them from political interference or efficiency-driven erosion, recognizing them as strategic infrastructure for generational stability rather than mere domestic tradition. As evening rituals unfolded and palace corridors softened into quiet illumination, the monarch experienced an internal deceleration that mirrored childhood bedtime routines, allowing neural recovery and emotional integration after long cognitive exertion. This capacity for restorative quiet preserved clarity across years of responsibility, preventing burnout and preserving ethical consistency under cumulative pressure. The rhythm of seasons continued to mark time gently rather than urgently, reinforcing patience, continuity, and acceptance of gradual change as core leadership virtues. Even during moments of personal vulnerability or physical aging, the emotional scaffolding built during childhood provided resilience, preventing fear-based decision-making and preserving relational openness rather than defensive rigidity. The ruler increasingly perceived authority as stewardship of trust rather than exercise of control, a perspective deeply rooted in early moral modeling by caregivers who demonstrated responsibility through consistency, empathy, and quiet reliability rather than dominance. Across the kingdom, this leadership tone permeated institutional culture, influencing how disputes were resolved, how innovation was integrated, and how collective identity evolved, generating long-term stability rather than volatile cycles of reform and reaction. And so, within the slow unfolding of mature governance, the invisible architecture of caregiving continued to guide history through sustained emotional intelligence, ethical coherence, and generational continuity, affirming that the most enduring power shaping civilizations operates quietly within the earliest moments of human development, rather than the visible stages of political spectacle. As time continued its quiet passage, the monarch's relationship with memory deepened, not as a collection of isolated events but as a continuous emotional landscape shaped by countless small moments of care, guidance, and consistent presence that had structured perception itself long before conscious leadership emerged. The mind increasingly operated through pattern recognition rather than episodic recall, allowing the ruler to sense shifts in social mood, institutional stress, and relational tension before they surfaced openly. A sensitivity rooted in early childhood environments where caregivers encouraged attunement to subtle cues, tone changes, and emotional microsignals, rather than overt instruction alone. This heightened perceptual awareness enabled preventative intervention rather than crisis reaction, stabilizing governance through early calibration rather than emergency control. In council discussions addressing long-term infrastructure resilience, food security planning, and educational continuity, the monarch approached complexity with patient sequencing, recognizing that durable solutions require layered integration rather than rapid consolidation. This cognitive patience mirrored early learning rhythms where caregivers allowed concepts to unfold gradually through repetition, experiential learning, and reflective dialogue, rather than accelerated memorization. Even disagreements among advisors were navigated through curiosity rather than confrontation, preserving collaborative intelligence rather than fragmenting institutional trust. The ruler's emotional neutrality in conflict did not signal detachment but regulatory stability, allowing diverse perspectives to coexist without escalating threat responses. Outside formal governance, solitude increasingly functioned as cognitive maintenance rather than withdrawal, supporting neural recovery and integrative processing after sustained executive demand. Walking slowly through shaded courtyards or listening to distant water flowing through palace fountains activated embodied memory patterns associated with early soothing routines, reinforcing parasympathetic regulation and emotional coherence. These physiological states preserve decision quality and ethical clarity by preventing chronic stress accumulation. The monarch's capacity to remain grounded during prolonged uncertainty reinforced public confidence and prevented rumor-driven volatility across social networks. Citizens unconsciously mirrored leadership calm, stabilizing markets, civic cooperation, and institutional compliance without coercive enforcement. This regulatory effect demonstrated how emotional intelligence embedded in leadership scales upward through social systems, shaping collective behavior through tone rather than command. As generational mentorship intensified, the monarch invested increasing attention in observing how young heirs internalized emotional regulation, curiosity, and moral reasoning, recognizing that future governance stability depended not on knowledge transfer alone, but on nervous system development and relational security cultivated during early childhood. Subtle adjustments were made to nursery environments, learning rhythms, and caregiver support structures to preserve quality rather than efficiency, protecting the integrity of formative developmental processes from external political pressure. The ruler's sensitivity to these variables reflected lived understanding of how deeply early relational patterns shape adult leadership capacity. In reflective moments, gratitude emerged not as sentimentality, but as systemic awareness of interdependence, recognizing that individual competence is always the visible surface of collective unseen labor. This humility reinforced ethical restraint and reduced the temptation toward self-glorification or legacy obsession. Even the acceptance of mortality and generational transition unfolded with emotional steadiness rather than fear, supported by early secure attachment that normalized continuity rather than control. The monarch increasingly perceived life itself as cyclical stewardship rather than linear accumulation, aligning leadership psychology with ecological rhythm rather than competitive dominance. As evening descended and palace lights softened into tranquil constellations along stone corridors, the ruler allowed cognitive activity to gradually decelerate, preserving sleep quality and long-term neural resilience essential for sustained judgment clarity. This nightly regulation mirrored childhood bedtime structures once guided by caregivers who understood the nervous system's need for rhythm, predictability, and emotional safety. Over decades, these patterns compounded into a leadership identity characterized not by dramatic authority, but by steady coherence, ethical consistency, and emotional maturity that quietly shaped institutional stability across generations. And within this continuity, the invisible labor of women who had built the foundation of regulation, empathy, and reflective intelligence continued to guide the unseen currents of history, proving once again that enduring power flows not from spectacle or dominance, but from sustained care embedded deeply within human development itself. As the later years of leadership unfolded with quiet inevitability, the monarch's inner orientation shifted further away from personal identity and toward stewardship of continuity, where decisions were evaluated less by immediate outcome and more by their capacity to preserve coherence across generations, a perspective made possible only because emotional regulation, ethical stability, and reflective discipline had been deeply embedded during early caregiving years. Authority increasingly felt like custodianship of trust, rather than expression of power, and this psychological orientation softened the relationship with control, allowing flexibility, patience, and humility to coexist naturally with responsibility. The ruler became increasingly attentive to subtle indicators of institutional health, the emotional tone of administrative conversations, the adaptability of mid-level leadership, the resilience of community networks, and the clarity of ethical boundaries within decision processes. These sensitivities reflected early training and attunement where caregivers encouraged noticing emotional shifts and environmental patterns long before rational interpretation developed. Such perceptual refinement enabled early course correction rather than reactive intervention, sustaining systemic stability without visible disruption. In strategic planning sessions addressing long-term environmental stewardship, population resilience, and cross-generational education frameworks, the monarch integrated ecological timescales rather than political cycles, recognizing that true governance must align with natural rhythms rather than short-term optimization. This orientation mirrored childhood exposure to seasonal observation, patient cultivation practices, and delayed gratification exercises embedded quietly within caregiving routines. Emotional steadiness during uncertainty continued to regulate collective anxiety, reinforcing social trust and institutional cooperation, even when external conditions fluctuated unpredictably. The ruler's presence functioned less as directive command and more as stabilizing resonance, guiding collective behavior through coherence rather than coercion. In private reflection, the monarch increasingly revisited early relational memories not as nostalgia, but as foundational architecture that shaped perception itself, acknowledging that personal temperament, ethical instincts, and stress tolerance were inherited patterns cultivated by caregivers long before conscious identity emerged. This awareness deepened humility and softened the need for recognition, reinforcing service orientation over legacy projection. Even physical aging was met with acceptance rather than resistance, supported by early emotional security that normalized transition rather than control. Succession preparation unfolded gradually, emphasizing emotional maturity, relational intelligence, and ethical grounding over technical competence alone, ensuring that future leadership inherited the same psychological stability embedded across generations. Nursery environments remain protected spaces of emotional safety and exploratory learning, shielded from performance pressure or premature specialization, preserving the developmental conditions necessary for resilient leadership formation. Observing caregivers gently regulate young nervous systems reaffirmed the monarch's understanding that the true foundation of governance lies within early relational stability, rather than institutional design alone. Across the realm, policies increasingly reflected long-range coherence, rather than short-term gain, reinforcing sustainability, social trust, and adaptive capacity across systems. Even when challenges arose, the emotional intelligence embedded within leadership culture prevented fragmentation, allowing collaborative problem-solving rather than defensive polarization. As evening rituals continued to anchor daily rhythm, neural recovery remained prioritized, preserving clarity and preventing cumulative stress erosion. This disciplined self-regulation extended leadership longevity and decision quality, far beyond what force of will alone could sustain. The monarch's relationship with silence deepened, allowing thought to settle naturally without compulsion toward constant stimulation or distraction, supporting integrative cognition and ethical clarity. Over time, the boundary between personal identity and institutional stewardship softened, revealing leadership as a temporary custodial role within a much larger continuum shaped by countless unseen contributors across generations. And within this unfolding awareness, gratitude toward the women who had built the invisible architecture of emotional regulation, cognitive discipline, and moral stability continued to mature quietly, reinforcing the understanding that history is guided less by singular authority than by sustained care transmitted patiently through human development itself. As the rhythm of leadership continued to soften into reflective equilibrium, the monarch experienced an increasing clarity about the invisible systems that quietly sustain societal stability, recognizing that the most durable structures were not physical monuments or legal codes, but behavioral patterns transmitted through relational continuity across generations. These patterns governed how conflict was approached, how uncertainty was metabolized, how empathy was expressed, and how responsibility was internalized, forming a living architecture far more resilient than any single policy framework. The ruler increasingly observed how early emotional scaffolding shaped adult institutional behavior, noticing that administrators who displayed calm adaptability often carried histories of secure early mentorship, while rigidity and defensive control frequently correlated with fragmented developmental experiences. This observation reinforced investment in caregiver education, emotional literacy training, and long-term relational stability within the royal household and surrounding communities. The monarch understood that governance effectiveness emerged not only from intelligence or discipline, but from nervous system regulation cultivated during childhood, shaping attention span, impulse control, and ethical reasoning capacity. In strategic dialogues addressing future social resilience, the ruler prioritized early childhood infrastructure, caregiver support ecosystems, and intergenerational continuity mechanisms, recognizing these as foundational assets rather than auxiliary services. Such priorities reflected deep appreciation for the women whose unseen labor had shaped the monarch's own regulatory capacity and leadership coherence. Quiet moments of contemplation increasingly centered on the concept of transmission rather than achievement, perceiving life as a conduit through which values, emotional stability, and cognitive integrity flowed forward, rather than possessions or titles. This perspective softened attachment to outcome control and strengthened patience during transitional uncertainty. Succession mentoring continued with gentle emphasis on reflective self-awareness, emotional responsibility, and relational intelligence rather than technical mastery alone, ensuring that leadership continuity preserved internal coherence rather than merely procedural competence. Observing young heirs gradually internalize emotional rhythm through consistent caregiver attunement reaffirmed the monarch's belief that sustainable governance begins in the nursery long before public accountability emerges. Institutional culture slowly mirrored these values, favoring collaboration, ethical transparency, and long-term coherence over reactive competition or short-term dominance. When inevitable external pressures surfaced, collective resilience remained intact, supported by emotionally regulated leadership that modeled stability rather than alarm. The monarch's daily routines increasingly aligned with biological rhythms, prioritizing restorative sleep, measured activity, and cognitive decompression, preserving neural health and decision quality into later years. Silence became a companion rather than an absence, allowing integration of experience without cognitive overload. Even the concept of legacy transformed from personal remembrance into continuity of psychological stability, embedded within future generations. Gratitude matured into quiet stewardship, guiding decisions toward protecting the invisible foundations that sustain human flourishing across time. As dusk settled gently across palace corridors and distant city lights shimmered softly in the evening air, the monarch allowed awareness to rest within the steady flow of continuity, trusting that the unseen labor of caregivers would continue shaping the future long after individual authority dissolved into collective memory. And within this calm acceptance, the hidden lives of women who raised royal children remained alive not in statues or chronicles, but in the stable nervous systems, ethical clarity, and relational intelligence quietly guiding generations yet to come. As the final seasons of stewardship unfolded with gentle inevitability, the monarch's awareness expanded beyond the boundaries of personal experience and into the broader continuum of human continuity, recognizing that identity itself is a temporary convergence of countless relational influences shaped long before conscious memory forms. The ruler no longer perceived leadership as possession or performance, but as a quiet relay of trust carried forward through emotional stability, ethical clarity, and relational coherence cultivated across generations. Every measured decision, every moment of restraint, every patient act of listening reflected the unseen architecture built by caregivers whose steady presence had shaped the nervous system long before language, logic, or ambition emerged. These women had transmitted more than instruction. They had embedded rhythm, safety, curiosity, and emotional intelligence into developing minds, creating the invisible foundation upon which public authority later rested. As the monarch reflected on the long arc of responsibility, gratitude deepened into reverence for the subtle power of care, recognizing that history's most enduring forces operate quietly through attachment, regulation, and relational consistency, rather than spectacle or conquest. Succession unfolded not as a rupture, but as a natural transition guided by emotional maturity and shared values rather than urgency or fear. The next generation entered stewardship carrying within them the same internal coherence once nurtured through attentive caregiving, allowing continuity to persist without disruption. Institutional stability flowed effortlessly from this internal alignment, reinforcing social trust, adaptive resilience, and ethical restraint across the realm. Even the experience of aging softened into acceptance rather than resistance, supported by early emotional security that normalized change as a natural rhythm rather than a threat to identity. The monarch's daily rituals gradually simplified, emphasizing stillness, reflection, and restorative balance, rather than accumulation or control. Silence became a sanctuary where thought settled into clarity and memory, dissolved into quiet presence. In these moments, the ruler sensed the countless unseen hands that had shaped this calm capacity for equilibrium, acknowledging that no individual stands alone within the architecture of competence and wisdom. As evening light filtered softly across familiar stone corridors and distant echoes of palace life faded into tranquil hush, the monarch allowed awareness to rest within gratitude rather than legacy, trusting that the invisible labor of caregivers would continue shaping future generations long after personal authority faded into collective memory. The hidden lives of women who raised royal children lived onward not in chronicles or monuments but in steady hearts, regulated minds, ethical choices, and compassionate leadership quietly guiding human continuity through time. And within this gentle closure, the story itself dissolved into silence, leaving behind a calm rhythm of reflection, safety, and enduring care, inviting the listener to rest peacefully within the timeless flow of unseen influence and quiet human connection.